Most believers have been taught to think the tithe is mainly about money. Increase, return, the harvest coming back, the windows opening, and something financial falling into the hand. But Malachi is showing us something deeper than a transaction. God is not presenting the tithe as a religious way to purchase blessing. He is revealing covenant order. He is revealing government. He is revealing what happens when the life of a believer comes back under the rule of heaven. And this is where the correction must begin. The devourer is not attracted to poverty. The devourer is attracted to disorder. He enters where things are out of alignment. He moves where God is not being acknowledged as source. He feeds where fear governs decisions, where anxiety drives stewardship, where the heart says, I must protect myself because I am my own provider. Poverty is not the doorway. Disorder is the doorway. Misalignment is the doorway. A life where God is honored with words, but not recognized in practice, becomes vulnerable to leakage, confusion, and spiritual erosion. The tithe does not buy God's blessing. It does not purchase His favor. It does not bribe heaven into activity. God is not for sale. His goodness is not awakened by currency. His covenant is not manipulated by religious payment. The tithe is not man reaching up to force God's hand. It is the believer bowing the heart and saying, You are the source, not me. You are the owner, not me. You are the provider, not me. You are Lord over the whole, not merely over a portion. That is why the enemy fights this subject so fiercely. Satan is not merely afraid of the money leaving your hand. He is afraid of the order entering your life. He knows that ordered trust closes doors. Ordered trust shuts down leaks. Ordered trust silences confusion, breaks financial panic, steadies the soul, and brings the believer into a posture where heaven has legal room to govern. The enemy wants you scattered. God brings you into order. The enemy wants you anxious. God brings you into rest. The enemy wants you trying to survive by your own strength. God brings you back to covenant. So do not hear this as condemnation over what has been missed. Hear it as revelation for what God is restoring. This is not about shame. This is about alignment. This is not about guilt. This is about access being removed from the devourer and authority being restored to the believer. If you desire divine order in your finances, in your peace, in your home, and in the hidden places of your life, stay with this teaching. Subscribe in faith, not as a ritual, but as a point of agreement, and write these words, Lord, bring my life into your order. Because the tithe is not a payment for blessing. It is covenant order in motion, and where God's order is honored, the devourer loses his right to consume the harvest. Now listen to the order of God's own words, because the order is the revelation. Malachi 3:10 says, Bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house, and prove me now herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven, and pour you out a blessing. But God does not stop there. The next breath of the covenant is not merely more coming in. It is protection over what is already there. And I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes, and he shall not destroy the fruits of your ground. Most believers rush to the windows and miss the rebuke. They hear, open heaven, and immediately their mind runs to increase, opportunity, money, overflow, provision, and supply. And yes, God is a provider. Yes, heaven is not poor. Yes, the Father delights in caring for His children. But the promise of Malachi is deeper than more. It is not only a promise that heaven will release. It is a promise that God Himself will stand guard. That is why this passage must be read with covenant eyes. God is not saying, "Pay me and I will bless you." He is saying, "Honor me as source, and I will stand between your harvest and the destroyer." He is not presenting a religious transaction. He is revealing divine government. Bring the tithe. Prove my faithfulness. Let heaven's windows open over your life. Then watch me rebuke the force that destroys fruit before harvest, drains strength before completion, and consumes increase before it can become legacy. The devourer is not only lack of money. That is where many have missed it. The devourer can appear as wasted effort. You work, but nothing settles. You plan, but nothing holds. You earn, but peace never comes. It can appear as restless decisions, sudden drains, family pressure, confusion, anxiety, emergency after emergency, repairs that never end, momentum that gets sick before it matures, and harvest that comes into your hand but never remains in your house. There is a destruction that does not always look like poverty. Sometimes it looks like constant instability. Sometimes it looks like provision without preservation. Sometimes it looks like open doors without wisdom, income without order, activity without fruit, labor without rest. The devourer does not need to steal everything at once if he can keep your life leaking. He does not need to stop every blessing if he can destroy the fruit before it ripens. This is why Malachi's promise is protection before it is provision. God says, "I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes." Not you will wrestle him down. Not you will outthink him. Not you will carry the whole burden of spiritual resistance by yourself. I will rebuke. The Lord of hosts speaks as covenant defender. The one who owns the field, owns the seed, owns the rain, and owns the harvest says, "When you honor my order, I will confront what your strength cannot reach." The tithe puts the life in a position where heaven has legal right to govern what earth cannot protect. It says, "Father, this harvest is not independent. This house is not self-owned. This increase is not self-made. You are the source, not me. You are the owner, not me. You are the protector, not me." And when that confession becomes practice, divine order enters the field. Malachi is not merely a financial verse. It is a covenant order verse. It is God teaching His people that provision must come under government, or provision can be devoured. More money cannot protect a disordered life. More income cannot heal a leaking vessel. More opportunity cannot preserve a harvest that stands outside divine order. But when the tithe comes first, the heart comes into alignment, the house comes under covering, and the harvest comes under heaven's jurisdiction. So do not only ask, "Lord, what are you bringing in?" Ask also, "Lord, what are you protecting from leaking out?" Because sometimes the blessing is not only the new door. Sometimes the blessing is the closed mouth of the devourer. Sometimes the miracle is not more in your hand, but peace in what remains. Sometimes the evidence of open heaven is that waste stops, confusion breaks, strength returns, and fruit finally abides. But Malachi is not the beginning of the tithe. Malachi reveals the protection attached to it. But the root of the tithe goes deeper than protection. It reaches into covenant identity. It reaches into the place where a man stands before God with substance in his hand and says, "You are the source, not me. You are the owner, not me. You are the provider, not me." That is what the tithe says before it ever says anything about money. It is a confession, not merely a calculation, not merely a percentage, not merely a religious habit passed down through church culture. The tithe is faith made visible. It is worship with weight. It is trust that can be measured. It is the heart taking the first portion and placing it before God as a declaration that the whole life belongs to Him. Money has a strange way of revealing lordship. Not because money is greater than other things, but because money touches survival. It touches security. It touches tomorrow. It touches the plan. It touches the image a person has of himself. It touches questions like, will I have enough? Am I safe? Can I afford obedience? Can I trust God when the numbers are speaking loudly? That is why the tithe is so powerful. It brings faith out of the realm of theory and into the place where trust becomes practical. Many people say God is Lord until lordship touches what they depend on. Many say God is provider until provision must be honored before it is fully understood. Many say God is first until the first portion arrives, and the heart must decide whether God is truly first or merely included. The tithe does not make God Lord. He is Lord already. The tithe acknowledges His lordship. It brings the believer into agreement with what is eternally true. It says, "Father, my life is not self-originating. My increase did not begin with my intelligence. My future is not held together by my effort alone. My hands may work, but you give strength to my hands. My mind may plan, but you give wisdom to my mind. My doors may open, but you are the one who makes a way." This is why the tithe is identity before it is income. Sons and daughters do not tithe like spiritual orphans trying to get heaven's attention. They do not come trembling as though God must be bribed into kindness. They do not give the first portion to purchase love, favor, or mercy. They tithe because they already belong. They tithe because they are already in covenant. They tithe because the Father is faithful, and their substance becomes a witness that they know who He is. Before there was a law commanding Israel, there was Abraham honoring Melchizedek. Genesis says that Abraham gave him tithes of all. That moment did not begin as a tax. It did not begin as religious pressure. It was honor. It was recognition. Abraham had just seen the hand of God deliver, protect, and prosper him. And when he met the priest of the Most High God, he gave the tithe as a confession. He was saying, "The victory did not come from me alone. The increase did not originate in me. The Most High God is possessor of heaven and earth." Recognition came before obligation. Honor came before regulation. Covenant consciousness came before religious system. And this is where the heart finds relief. Self-reliance says, "I must keep everything because I am alone." Covenant says, "I can honor God first because He is faithful." Self-reliance clutches. Covenant releases. Self-reliance counts every coin with fear. Covenant orders every portion with trust. Self-reliance says, "If I do not protect myself, no one will." Covenant says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The tithe breaks the illusion that provision begins and ends with human effort. It breaks the lie that you are the source of your own life. It breaks the pressure that says everything depends on your striving, your strategy, your strength, your control. The tithe lets the soul breathe again because it returns the heart to truth. God is source. God is owner. God is provider. God is Lord. And when that confession becomes practical, peace begins to return. The believer is no longer trying to carry the weight of being his own God. The heart comes out of panic. The soul comes out of orphan fear. The mind comes out of endless calculation. Rest begins to rise because order has been restored. The tithe is the believer's practical confession that God is Lord over the whole life, not merely over a religious portion of it. And this is where the Spirit of God begins to put his finger upon the real wound. Many believers have prayed for more income when heaven was trying to bring them into more order. They have asked God for increase, but God was dealing with the leaks. They have asked for larger provision, but God was touching the place where peace was draining out. Wisdom was being ignored. Discipline was being resisted. Unity was being broken. And stewardship was being treated as a burden instead of fellowship. More money cannot heal a disordered life. More money cannot quiet a fearful mind. More money cannot govern an undisciplined appetite. More money cannot restore a home where God is not first. More money cannot protect a harvest that is left uncovered by divine order. Provision may come, but if disorder remains, the devourer has places to work. Money comes, but anxiety devours it. Opportunity comes, but confusion wastes it. Increase comes, but pressure scatters it. Doors open, but fear mismanages them. Blessing arrives, but the heart is too weary, too hurried, too double-minded to steward what God has placed in its hands. This is why the tithe is not a religious payment. It is order. It is the first thing returning to the first one. It is the believer saying, "God, before I touch the rest, I acknowledge you over all." And when that order is restored, something deeper begins to happen than a change in numbers. The soul comes back into alignment. The mind becomes steadier. The heart becomes quieter. Giving becomes worship. Stewardship becomes fellowship. The believer is no longer grabbing at provision like an orphan trying to survive. The believer is standing as a son or daughter under the government of a faithful Father. The devourer is not rebuked by panic. He is not rebuked by striving. He is not rebuked by desperate religious bargaining. He is rebuked by God's authority, operating where God's order is honored. There is a difference between begging God to rescue a harvest and placing that harvest under His lordship from the beginning. There is a difference between asking God to bless disorder and yielding to the order through which blessing can be protected. The tithe does not manipulate God. The tithe aligns the life. And where the life is aligned, heaven has legal ground to govern what belongs to God. Order protects peace. Order protects harvest. Order protects decision-making. Order protects the home. Order protects the believer from being ruled by fear. Order protects the mind from being driven by every report, every bill, every delay, every threat, every voice that says, "You will not have enough." When God is first, fear loses its throne. When God is first, money loses its voice as master. When God is first, the believer is no longer led by pressure, but by covenant. Peace begins to return because the heart knows, I am not the source. I am not the owner. I am not alone. Order is not restrictive. It is protective. Order is not a cage around the believer. It is a boundary against the devourer. The enemy wants you scattered because scattered things are easily consumed. He wants your thoughts scattered, your priorities scattered, your finances scattered, your home scattered, your affections scattered. But divine order gathers the life back under God. It brings the first back to God, the heart back to trust, the mind back to clarity, the home back to peace, and the hand back to faithful stewardship. There are people who receive increase and still feel poor because disorder is eating their peace. There are people who earn more than they have ever earned and still cannot rest because fear has become their financial counselor. There are people surrounded by opportunity who cannot move because confusion has devoured their courage. That is not merely a budgeting issue. That is not merely an income issue. That is a spiritual order issue. And when the tithe is restored as covenant honor, it begins to speak to the whole life. It says, God is first here. God governs here. God is trusted here. God has access here. Then stewardship changes. It is no longer cold management. It becomes fellowship with the provider. You begin to ask differently. You begin to decide differently. You begin to spend differently. You begin to wait differently. You begin to give differently. The hand becomes trained by honor. The heart becomes trained by trust. The mind becomes trained by peace. And what once felt like loss begins to feel like liberty. Because the tithe was never God taking something from you. It was God establishing order around you. Beloved, the answer is not always more. Sometimes the answer is order. Sometimes God protects the next level by correcting the present disorder. Sometimes He prepares the harvest by first healing the stewardship. Sometimes He answers the prayer for increase by teaching the heart how to keep peace when increase comes. Because divine order closes leaks that money cannot fix. It protects provision, peace, and purpose from being devoured. And when God is first, the whole life begins to come under the quiet strength of His government. When Malachi speaks of the windows of heaven, many minds run immediately to money. They imagine heaven opening like a storehouse of coins, like God is simply promising a larger deposit, a sudden increase, an unexpected supply. And God can provide. God does provide. He is not limited by the channels men understand. But the windows are deeper than money. Windows are not first about supply. Windows are about sight. A window does not merely let something in. A window lets you see. It changes perspective. It brings light into a closed room. It allows the one inside to behold what could not be seen while the room was shut, dark, and confined. This is one of the hidden mercies of divine order. When the believer comes into alignment, heaven does not only release provision to the hand, heaven releases clarity to the heart. The eyes begin to open. The mind begins to settle. The spirit begins to discern. What fear had hidden becomes visible. What pressure had distorted becomes plain. What anxiety had magnified begins to lose its power. When heaven's windows open, you begin to see what you could not see before. You see better decisions. You see wiser timing. You see hidden waste. You see the partnership that has been draining your peace. You see the habit that has been consuming your increase. You see the open door that fear made you overlook. You see the act of obedience that seemed small, but carried the wisdom of God inside it. This is why the enemy fights sight. The devourer does not need to destroy everything at once if he can keep a man blind. Blindness will make a man waste what prayer brought in. Blindness will make a woman spend emotionally what God intended her to steward strategically. Blindness will make a family react instead of discern, rush instead of wait, panic instead of listen, and then call the loss warfare when some of it was simply the fruit of confusion. Much of the devourer's work depends on haste. Haste in decisions, haste in purchases, haste in commitments, haste in relationships, haste in saying yes because pressure is loud and wisdom is quiet. But when the tithe trains the heart to look upward before it looks outward, a new government begins to operate within the believer. The believer no longer reads life only through bills, markets, deadlines, inflation, lack, and human limitation. The believer begins to ask, "Father, what are you saying? Where are you leading? What belongs to me and what only looks good? What is provision and what is distraction? What is harvest and what is a trap dressed like opportunity?" That question is wealth. That discernment is provision. One word from God can preserve more than an unexpected check. One corrected decision can save years of loss. One restrained impulse can protect a household from unnecessary pressure. One closed door can be mercy. One act of wisdom can become a shield around the future. Do not reduce provision to money arriving. Revelation is provision. Clarity is provision. Discernment is provision. Peace is provision. A calm mind under heaven's government is provision, because it can recognize what panic would have wasted. The tithe is not magic. It is not a religious lever. It is not a spiritual technique to force outcomes. It is a covenant act that puts the heart in order, and order makes the eyes clear. Jesus said, "If thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light." When the eye is no longer divided between trust and fear, between God as source and self as source, light enters the whole life. The believer begins to see finances differently, time differently, relationships differently, opportunity differently, the future differently. And when sight returns, dominion returns. A blind believer is easily driven by circumstances, but a seeing believer is governed by covenant wisdom. He is not merely reacting to what the economy announces. She is not merely trembling before what the account balance says. They are standing under an open heaven, receiving instruction, moving with restraint, obeying with confidence, and stewarding with authority. The opened windows of heaven release the sight that enables the believer to protect, steward, and multiply what God provides. First comes light, then comes order, then comes increase that can be kept. And this brings us to a word many believers have never connected to the tithe: jurisdiction. The tithe is a statement of government. It is the believer standing before God with the first and saying, "This life belongs under your rule. This house belongs under your rule. This increase belongs under your rule. This future belongs under your rule. It is not merely what leaves the hand. It is what the hand is declaring. It is not merely an amount. It is an altar. It is not merely money moving from one place to another. It is lordship being made practical in the material realm. Because every life is governed by something. Fear can govern a life. Lack can govern a life. Debt can govern a life. The opinions of men can govern a life. The condition of the economy can govern a life. Anxiety can sit on the throne and issue commands. Panic can become a prophet. Pressure can become a master. And when the heart is governed by these things, even good decisions become heavy. Even wise planning becomes restless. Even work becomes driven by survival instead of strengthened by covenant. But when the tithe is honored, the believer is saying, I refuse to let fear be my government. I refuse to let the economy be my Lord. I refuse to let visible conditions define the authority over my life. I am not merely subject to the systems of this age. I am a citizen of the kingdom of God. That is why the devourer operates most freely where there is no acknowledged order. Where God is praised with the mouth, but given no first place in practice. Where increase comes in, but it is treated as independent. Where the house receives provision, but provision is never brought under covenant recognition. The devourer does not need permission from your words if your order contradicts your confession. He studies disorder. He studies first place. He studies what governs the heart. If God is last, fear will speak first. If God is occasional, anxiety will become constant. If God is honored only after everything else has demanded its share, then material life remains under divided government. And divided government always produces leakage. Divided government produces confusion. Divided government produces double-minded stewardship. One moment trusting God, and the next moment bowing to fear. The world says, you are subject to the economy. Covenant says, you are seated under another government. The world says, your life rises and falls only by markets, prices, wages, interest rates, shortages, and human systems. Covenant says, those things may touch the earth, but they are not Lord over the child of God. The world says, protect yourself, because no one is watching over you. Covenant says, honor the Lord with thy substance, and with the first fruits of all thine increase. This does not mean the believer becomes careless. It does not mean the believer stops planning, stops working, stops budgeting, stops learning, stops building, or stops walking in wisdom. No, divine order never produces irresponsibility. Divine order empowers responsibility. It takes diligence out of fear and puts it into faith. It takes planning out of panic and puts it into peace. It takes labor out of bondage and puts it into partnership. There is a difference between working because you are afraid you will not survive and working because you are joined to the purpose of God. There is a difference between saving because fear is your shepherd and stewarding because wisdom is your servant. There is a difference between planning under the pressure of lack and planning under the light of heaven. The same hands may work, the same mind may plan, the same house may budget, but the government is different. The tithe changes the government. It says, my provision is not lawless. My increase is not uncovered. My future is not abandoned to chance. My work is under heaven. My seed is under heaven. My decisions are under heaven. My house is under heaven. And where heaven governs, heaven has the right to protect. Where heaven is acknowledged, heaven has the right to direct. Where God is given first place, God is not treated as an emergency contact after disorder has already devoured the field. He is honored as Lord before the harvest, during the harvest, and over the harvest. This is why tithing is not superstition. It is not a magic formula. It is not a religious trick. It is not a mechanical button that forces heaven to respond. God cannot be manipulated by ceremony when the heart is absent. But faith always moves. Lordship always expresses itself. Covenant always becomes visible somewhere. And in the tithe, faith becomes visible in the place where fear often hides deepest, the place of provision. The tithe is faith in motion. It is lordship in practice. It is partnership with God's order in the earth. It is the believer saying, "Father, I will not wait until everything feels secure before I honor you as secure. I will not wait until the crisis comes before I remember you are Lord. I will not treat you as rescuer only. I honor you as ruler." Immature faith tries to use God for rescue while keeping control. Mature faith yields control before rescue is needed. Immature faith says, "Lord, help me now that everything is breaking." Mature faith says, "Lord, govern me now, so that what you entrust to me stands under your order." Immature faith wants provision without surrender. Mature faith understands that surrender is protection. Immature faith wants God to bless a structure he has not been allowed to govern. Mature faith says, "Build the structure, Lord. Set the order. Take first place." And that kind of faith is not afraid of responsibility. It is not afraid of discipline. It is not afraid of wisdom. It knows that budgets can be holy. Work can be holy. Planning can be holy. Saving can be holy. Giving can be holy. Increase can be holy when it stands under the government of God. So the tithe is not merely about what you give. It is about where you stand. It is about which government has authority over your provision. It is about whether your material life is wandering without covenant recognition or standing under the declared rule of heaven. And when the believer brings the tithe, something is being announced in the unseen realm. This life is not ownerless. This house is not uncovered. This harvest is not common. This future is not ruled by fear. God is source. God is owner. God is Lord. God is governor. And because his government is honored, his protection has legal ground to operate here. And now the heart must hear the mercy inside the promise. God did not say, "You will rebuke the devourer." He did not say, "You will discover every hidden place where loss is entering and close it by your own intelligence." He did not say, "You will carry the whole warfare of preservation upon your shoulders." He said, "I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes." That is covenant relief. There are things you can manage, and there are things only God can rebuke. There are budgets you can write, decisions you can correct, disciplines you can build, and wisdom you must obey. But there is a level of devouring that human strength cannot wrestle down. You can work harder and still feel drained. You can plan better and still watch the plan collapse. You can earn more and still wonder where it went. You can wake early, sleep late, stretch every dollar, count every obligation, and still feel as though something invisible is eating the fruit before it matures. This is why the promise is so tender. The Lord of hosts steps into the weary place and says, I will rebuke. Not merely, I will advise. Not merely, I will encourage. Not merely, I will watch you struggle. I will rebuke. I will speak against the thing that has been speaking against your harvest. I will confront what has been confronting your peace. I will stand between your seed and the destroyer. I will deal with the devourer at a level your anxiety could never reach. The believer was never called to live in financial obsession. You were never called to guard your life with fear as though fear were wisdom. You were never called to become your own savior, your own covering, your own final defense. Fear checks everything and still rests nowhere. Anxiety counts everything and still trusts nothing. Self-protection builds walls and still feels exposed. But divine order invites divine intervention. When God's order is honored, God's government has room to act. This is where many weary hearts will recognize themselves. The paycheck comes, and before peace can settle, it disappears. The plan begins, and before it gains strength, it collapses. The harvest starts to grow, and before it matures, something attacks it. The peace drains away. The strength drains away. The joy drains away. The home receives provision, but the soul never enters rest. There is always one more emergency, one more repair, one more pressure, one more unexplained loss pulling on the edges of the harvest. Hear me carefully. This word is not coming to shame the struggling believer. God is not mocking the weary. He is not standing over the bruised heart with accusation. He is calling his people back into fellowship, back into order, back into trust, back into confident obedience. The correction of God is not rejection. It is rescue. He corrects what is out of order because he loves what belongs to him. The tithe is not panic dressed in religion. It is not fear trying to buy safety. It is not desperation throwing money at heaven. The tithe is covenant order in motion. It is God saying, "Bring the first into my order." And the believer responding, "I trust you with the whole, because you are faithful over the part." That response breaks something in the heart. It breaks the fever of self-rule. It breaks the lie that says, "If I release this, I will not be safe." It breaks the orphan thought that says, "I am alone in the field." The tithe becomes an altar where fear loses its authority and trust finds its voice again. So let this become confession, not merely information, not merely doctrine. Let the heart speak until the life comes into agreement with heaven. Father, I come out of fear. I come out of disorder. I acknowledge you as my source, my owner, and my provider. I bring the first into your order. I trust you with the whole, because you are faithful over the part. I refuse to live as though I am uncovered. I refuse to let anxiety govern what covenant has already placed under your care. And as that confession becomes obedience, rest begins to return. The believer stops wrestling shadows in human strength and starts standing under divine government. Peace rises. Clarity returns. Waste is confronted. The devourer meets a voice higher than yours. Because when the believer honors divine order, God confronts the devourer at a level human effort cannot reach. And when the life comes under the quiet strength of His government, fear begins to lose its language. The believer who once lived under pressure begins to breathe again. The heart that once woke up counting threats begins to wake up remembering covenant. The mind that once ran ahead into every possible lack begins to settle under the faithfulness of the Father. This is one of the hidden works of the tithe. It does not merely order the finances, it trains the heart out of fear. It keeps bringing the believer back to the same holy confession. God is my source. God is my provider. God is faithful. I am not alone. And every time that confession becomes practice, fear is confronted, panic is confronted, survival thinking is confronted. The old pressure that says, everything depends on me, begins to break under the revelation that everything rests upon Him. The tithe keeps the heart in the posture of rest, because it keeps the heart in the posture of trust. It continually reminds the believer that provision is not born from panic. Provision is not born from fear. Provision is not born from anxious striving, sleepless calculation, or the torment of self-preservation. Provision flows from the Father. Provision is governed by covenant. Provision is protected by divine order. The believer works, but he does not worship his work. The believer plans, but he does not bow to his plan. The believer stewards, but he does not carry the crushing weight of being his own source. That is the difference between orphan fear and covenant sonship. The orphan clutches because he fears abandonment. The orphan stores from terror, spends from insecurity, gives from guilt, and lives as though every decision may be the one that ruins him. But the son honors because he knows the Father. The daughter gives God the first because she knows the Father has not forgotten the rest. The child of covenant does not tithe to make God good. God is already good. He does not tithe to persuade God to care. God has already revealed His care. He does not tithe to purchase a place in the Father's house. He gives because he already belongs there. This is why guilt cannot produce the fruit that trust produces. Guilt may move the hand for a moment, but trust establishes the life. Fear may pressure a person into religious action, but covenant steadiness forms a new way of living. God is not looking for panic wrapped in obedience. He is drawing the heart into fellowship. He is teaching His people to honor Him without terror, to trust Him without bargaining, to obey Him without feeling abandoned. And as that trust grows, the practical fruit becomes visible. Peace rises, clarity returns, fear breaks, discipline strengthens, generosity becomes natural. Money loses its power to define identity. The believer no longer asks money to say, "You are safe." The believer no longer asks income to say, "You are valuable." The believer no longer asks the balance to say, "You have a future." The Father has already spoken. Covenant has already spoken. The Word has already spoken. Then stewardship becomes steady. Decisions are no longer made from desperation. Giving is no longer poisoned by dread. Saving is no longer driven by torment. Spending is no longer an attempt to heal insecurity. The heart becomes anchored. The hand becomes faithful. The mind becomes clear. The believer can look at provision without worshiping it, can face need without being ruled by it, and can honor God first without feeling that obedience is lost. Tithing does not make God faithful. It aligns the believer with the faithfulness that was already there. Tithing does not make God merciful. It brings the heart into agreement with the mercy already revealed in covenant. Tithing does not make heaven generous. It places the life under the order of the generous King. The goodness of God is not waiting for money to awaken it. His goodness is eternal. His care is covenantal. His nature is already love. The highest fruit, then, is not merely retained provision. It is renewed confidence before the Father. It is the soul standing without accusation, without panic, without the torment of financial fear, and saying, "Father, I trust you. My life is in your hands. My harvest is under your government. My future is covered by your faithfulness." That is covenant rest. That is the place where the tithe has done its deep work. It has led the heart out of fear and into trust, out of pressure and into peace, out of orphan survival and into the steadiness of a son who knows the Father will not fail. So let this revelation settle in the heart. The tithe does not buy blessing. It does not manipulate God. It does not turn the Father into a merchant or make heaven respond to human payment. The tithe acknowledges source. It establishes order. It opens sight. It places the life under heaven's government. It positions the believer where God himself says, "I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes." That is covenant rest. That is spiritual alignment. That is faith becoming visible in the place where fear once tried to rule. The believer is not throwing money into heaven, hoping God will notice. The believer is standing before the Father and saying, "All that I have came from you. All that I am belongs to you. All that is in my hand is under your lordship." And when that confession becomes practice, disorder loses its voice. Fear loses its throne. The devourer loses his access. Now say it with faith, not as empty words, not as religious noise. Say it as covenant confession. I am not alone. I am not ruled by fear. My Father is my source. My life is under divine order. My provision is under heaven's government. My harvest is not uncovered. My peace is not for sale. My obedience is not pressure. It is identity. My giving is not superstition. It is revelation. My tithe is not fear. It is fellowship. God is first in my life. God is Lord over my house. God is shepherd over my future. The windows of heaven are open over me. I receive sight. I receive wisdom. I receive restraint. I receive peace. And the devourer is rebuked for my sake. That is the sound of a heart coming out of panic and into covenant. That is the sound of a believer refusing to live as an orphan under financial fear. You do not obey to earn sonship. You obey because you are a son. You do not honor God to force his hand. You honor him because his hand has already been faithful. You do not tithe because you are terrified of loss. You tithe because revelation has taught you that order protects what fear can never preserve. So write this confession where faith can see it. My life is under God's order. and the devourer is rebuked for my sake. Let it become agreement. Let it become worship. Let it become a line in the Spirit that fear cannot cross. And if you are choosing covenant trust over financial fear, subscribe and continue in this teaching journey. Share this with someone who needs peace restored around provision, someone who has been carrying the burden of being their own source. God is not trying to take from you. He is restoring order around you, so what He gives can remain, mature, multiply, and bless others. Where God's order is honored, the devourer loses his right to consume the harvest.